Hello, and welcome to the Art of Being Human. Today I want to discuss post-traumatic stress syndrome. It is one of the things that happens to people, one of the conditions that people get from severe, sometimes life-threatening abuse. And a lot of soldiers come back with it. You know, we are very happy to have our soldiers come back from war, whether it's Afghanistan or whatever it is, wherever they are. We're so very happy to have them back. And I look at television and I see how wonderful it means, how wonderful it is when a soldier will come back and they'll surprise their child who is in school by walking in on the class, and it's a total surprise, and the child reacts and runs to them and they hug and so forth, and it's just a wonderful thing to see them come back. But you have to remember that some soldiers who have been through a lot, who have been in prison camps, concentration camps, or those who have seen a lot of combat, they may not come back as the same people. They have post-traumatic stress syndrome. But it's not just soldiers who get it. Anybody who has abuse can have elements of post-traumatic stress. Anyone who's had a horrible time, dysfunctional family, drug abuse in the family, physical abuse in the family, they can end up by having PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. I want to talk about that because it is a product of abuse, and usually what happens is the person has either been abused or they've seen abuse. You can get post-traumatic stress when you haven't been abused, but you've seen things, and that has had an effect on you, and that can give it to you as well. I want to tell you a little story. This is a true story. I was talking with my sister on the phone. This is a few years back. I was talking with my sister on the phone, and I was away, as I usually am, and she was in her home, and all of a sudden she kind of freaked out and became very frightened. She said, I've got to go, I've got to go, I've got to call the police. And I said, what is happening? What's going on? She says, someone's trying to get in and he's got a gun. Well, she was terrified, and I understand that. I was too. I says, I'm leaving. Call me as soon as it's resolved. And so I had a chance to talk to her later. It was a Vietnam vet who had come back, and he had flipped. His mind had flipped, and he thought he was still fighting in Vietnam when he was at home. And he was hers was not the only house. He was trying to enter other houses because he thought he was still fighting the war. His mind had done a flip, and he lost track of the fact that he was really at home. This is not wartime, but he was trying to fight the Viet Cong. And had he got in, who knows what would have happened to her. Well, they finally caught up with him. The police finally caught up with him, and they were able to stop this dangerous situation. But that's post-traumatic stress. That's a severe form of post-traumatic stress. It can do terrible things to you. If you've been abused, it can do terrible things to you. And that's something that you have to deal with. People who have either experienced abuse, they've seen death, they've seen injury, they've been threatened, sometimes their lives has been threatened. There was an advertisement on television where somebody had entered into a home and stolen things. And when the family was not home, and when the family got home, they found their home in disarray because someone had broken in. And they felt like if you've been stolen from, you felt that a part of you has been taken away. You don't feel safe anymore. Someone was able to get in. What if that person had been a killer? They would have been able to have gotten in. And instead, they stole a lot of things, and maybe that was their intent to do that. Maybe their intent was not to hurt. But it has elements of it of danger, putting yourself in danger, having somebody kind of steal part of your safety away from you. And as a result of that, according to the advertisement, the daughter could no longer sleep. She was afraid to sleep because she was afraid of being broken in on. And because the answer in the advertisement is to buy a certain security system so that can't happen, and then they were able to sleep again and so forth. But I only bring this up because if your safety is at risk, or you've been threatened, your safety has been threatened. I know when I was teaching, in another state. I was a college professor, and one of the students who was mentally disturbed, he was schizophrenic, came up to me one day. It was after the first class. I couldn't imagine it. The class went well, and he showed me a razor blade. He says, "I want you to keep this." And I says, "Why would I keep a razor blade?" Because I knew he was mentally unstable. Who would do something like that? He says, "I want you to protect yourself from me using this razor blade when I come to kill you." Well, you know, after so many threats like that, the police, campus police were involved, the town police were involved. I was given another office. He was put in a mental institution, but he got out of the mental institution. He started calling me, and when he called me, the police became involved with that. The telephone company became involved with it. They set up a special telephone system, so when he was calling me, he would just be getting a ring. I would never get the ring. They could set it up so that if he actually started talking to somebody, he reached an operator or something, I could listen in to what he was threatening, but he wouldn't know I was there. And I decided that was just too traumatic. I was having a hard enough time as it was. I had bodyguards. My students acted as bodyguards. It was a real dangerous situation. Could I get post-traumatic stress from that? Yeah, I could, because my safety was threatened. You know, it didn't bother me that much. I was a little unsure of going places without looking to see if he was around and all of that. He used to follow me around on campus. In another situation where I had a stalker, it was a church situation, and he used to try to chase me around the church, and he was also schizophrenic. Now, I'm not saying all schizophrenics are dangerous or anything like that, and I'm not saying that at all, because with medication and treatment, they have a lot of help available to them. The other thing to remember is that there are like 11 different types of schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia perhaps is the most difficult. But nonetheless, I went through those experiences, and if you go through bad experiences, it is possible for you to pick up a case of PTSD. So let me give you some more information about it. The intensity of it and the helpless feeling that you get if you have been threatened can lead you to having PTSD. You feel like you're re-experiencing trauma. If you have PTSD and you've had a lot of trauma, a lot of abuse in your past, then you will keep re-experiencing it. It keeps coming up, and that's why you have to have treatment for it. It may not be possible for you to get rid of those symptoms on your own. Certainly that man who thought he was still in Vietnam could not get rid of those symptoms on his own, and he needed to have treatment and did receive treatment. So the situations that can give you PTSD, it can be due to abuse, it can be due to military combat, to sexual assault, to physical assault, and physical assault could mean robbery, mugging, kidnapping, seeing somebody injured, being taken hostage, terrorist attack, seeing somebody die, an unexpected death that you happen to witness to, seeing torture, being a prisoner of war, concentration camps, I've mentioned that before, going through natural disasters. When you see that flood coming, or you see that tsunami coming and you're on the beach and you have to try to get away from it, and let's say you get away from it successfully, you get to higher ground, and you are all right. But the marks are there. It doesn't take much to cause a problem and to get PTSD. Accidents will happen, and that'll give you PTSD. Various illnesses can give you PTSD, especially if you are ill, and let's say you had a very difficult, life-threatening illness, and you get by it all right. You beat it out, but at the same time, you have a fear. Every time that you get a pain that you don't recognize, or you get a new symptom, you are going to just assume, that the illness has come back. You know, I know friends who have had cancer. They see a bruise on their skin. Could it be cancerous? They see a mole in the skin. Could it be cancerous? And anything like that can cause post-traumatic stress. It's after the fact, it's post. Terrible things have happened, or you've seen terrible things. It's post-trauma, not pre-trauma. You have had to have gone through it or see it, and then it comes. So it's something that you have to deal with in therapy. It's something that happens to you that causes you to be afraid, terribly, terribly afraid. Now, I was driving. This is another incident. I was driving home after I worked, and it was late at night. It was like about 11 o'clock at night. And I stopped at a stoplight. There'd been an accident on a road, which is very close to where I was. I could see it. And the police were there, so I knew they were taken care of. And there was one woman who was hysterical. I don't think she was the driver of the car. The driver of the car evidently was a young lady who was not responding. She wasn't waking up. And this woman screamed and screamed and screamed at her. Wake up, wake up. You've got to wake up. Please wake up. She was absolutely hysterical. She was crying, she was screaming, she was yelling. And I'm sure she thought that the lady had passed on. I'm sure she thought that the woman had been killed. Now, I don't know if she had been killed or not. I didn't stay. You know, the police were there were ambulances coming, so there's no reason for me to stay. There was nothing I could do that wasn't already done. But this poor woman was so hysterical. There was another case where I was teaching, and I mentioned this once before. I was teaching, and I was in my office. It was between classes. Somebody else was teaching a class. I was just working around in my office, and there was a woman in the hall, and all of a sudden she screamed, absolutely screamed at the top of her lungs. She was terrified. So I went out to see what was going on, and she was having an anxiety attack. If you've ever had an anxiety attack, you know that they can be terrifying because they're just so difficult to deal with. You are, I'd like to say, scared out of your mind. There's no way I can describe it really. If you've never had one, you were just frightened to death, absolutely frightened to death. And she didn't know what she was afraid of. This is the kind of fear and anxiety you would have if you have post-traumatic stress. After a while, you recognize it. Oh, it's an anxiety attack. But you feel so helpless and you feel so useless when you have it. You feel like you're immobilized. And you really are immobilized because it just sends that terror up. So the different types of fear and things that you can get, let me just review this. Fear, panic attacks, which we went over in the last segment, anxiety attacks, well, it was anxiety attacks we went over in the last segment, not panic attacks. Free-floating anxiety, they're all related. The phobias, simple and complex phobias, guilt and shame. All of these things that you can get. If you've been abused in any way, or if you've been raised in a cult and you have post-traumatic stress disorder, or if you've seen abuse, or if the abuse has happened to you, you know, it's just, it's a horrible thing to put up with. Fear is usually attached to something that's going on now, or something that's anticipated. But like, for example, you're about to give a speech and you haven't done any public speaking before and you're fearful. You can be very fearful. You can be so fearful that you are tempted not to do it. And so that's what fear is. Panic is more intense. When you panic, you're really immobilized. It's a step beyond fear. If you've experienced it probably before and you would recognize what it was as you experience it. Panic attacks, they can come in attacks where you get panicked and you don't know why you're panicked, but you're just terribly afraid. You're just afraid out of your wits. You don't know why, but there it is. You're terribly, terribly, terribly afraid. It's different than a phobia, because in a phobia, you are afraid in a certain situation and you are afraid of a certain thing. If you are afraid of dogs, then you see a dog, you'll get your phobic symptoms. They can be simple or they can be complex. A simple phobia is when you're bit by a dog, so now you're afraid of a dog. There's a direct causal relationship. You know what that relationship is. The complex phobia is difficult to kind of sort it out. There are several things that have happened and they've combined, and when you're in the presence of any of those things, then you can become very, very panicked and very phobic, but you don't necessarily see a direct causal relationship between your phobia and something that's happened to you in your past. It might be things that you're afraid of, things that bother you, kind of combined together, and then when you get the phobia, it's complex and it's hard to figure it out what it is. I told you once before about a friend of mine who couldn't go downstairs. She was very, very afraid of going downstairs. And she didn't know why she was afraid of going downstairs. She could go up. And I was in a psychology building. We were taking classes, and there was a long stairway to get up to the second floor where our classes were. She was fine getting up. She used to have to go down by sitting and just going down from step to step, sitting down. So we talked about it, and we figured out finally that her father, who was a pilot, used to fly around their house and wave to her. You know, he would get his plane low enough, tip it, he would bank it, and then he could wave to her out the window and she would wave back. This is when she was a little girl. Well, unfortunately, one day as he was flying, his plane went down. And he died in the plane crash, and she saw it. And that act of going down from a higher position, she related to the steps, going down from a higher position, and a result of that, she was not able to go downstairs. So that's more of a complex phobia because she didn't understand it. She didn't understand until we sorted it out, what was going on. But that kind of thing is very treatable. Phobias are very treatable. You have free-floating anxiety where you're terrified and you're afraid, but you don't know what of. It's like it's there, but you can't connect it to anything. Then you have the guilt, true and false guilt. I've kind of gone over that before, that goes along with PTSD, and the shame, the feeling of worthlessness. If you've been abused and you have a feeling of worthlessness as a result of that. And it's not your fault. The abuse is not your fault. The PTSD is not your fault. Nothing of this is not your fault. But you kind of feel guilty about it anyway, and that guilt has to be dealt with. All of these things that I've mentioned within the last 3 or 4 segments, how you feel about yourself, your symptoms, the symptoms and the attitudes that you have about yourself, your self-concept, how it makes you behave, the PTSD, all of this is in total being involved with cults and having PTSD from cults, which you certainly can get. All of this has to do with relationships. It changes relationships, and you need to get well from it in order for healthy relationships to continue. So next time, I'm going to talk to you about reporting abuse, and after that, we'll just go on with it, because there are other things that are involved that I want to bring up that will help you to understand your thought systems as you recover from abuse and how you can overcome some of the thought patterns that you have. And we will delineate those thought patterns, what they are and what you can do to help yourself. So I hope this has been a help to you. We're not quite through with this segment yet, but we're well on our way, and I will continue with it next time. Please join me then.